I think we've moved on a long way from the time when people may have said, oh, companies just exist to make money, if ever there was a time. Because actually, go back a bit further, there's always been a tradition of businesses caring about the society in which they exist, and even if their primary purpose is to generate profit, they actually are trying to do some good in the world as well. So I think I think they do have a responsibility, and I actually think most people broadly would agree. It's just the question is, what should those responsibilities be?
Hi, Richard.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for being on. Richard Wilson, everyone, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast this week. So you are the co-founder of Stop Funding Hate. Tell me a little bit about yourself, Richard, and tell me about Stop Funding Hate, why you set it up, when you set it up, and then we'll move on to what it does and all of that in a minute.
Yeah, it all started in the summer of 2016, when there was this huge surge in hate crime in the UK. And obviously this was happening in the context of the referendum, the post-referendum sort of atmosphere, but actually it had been preceded by years and years and years of really inflammatory newspaper front pages targeting migrants and Muslims particularly, but also many other groups as well. And it all just seemed to come to a head, and it was really shocking, I think, to a lot of people that this was all now playing out in the streets in a really, upsetting way. People were contacting us kind of who'd been personally affected or had friends that were personally affected. And I was among a number of people who were sort of talking to each other about what we could do to push back and to essentially challenge the media to stop this kind of demonization.
Yeah.
And so that was the starting point. And initially we were just running the campaign as volunteers. I was one of a group of people in there from the early days, and the sort of idea that we came up with for trying to essentially give a bit of a wake-up call to some of these newspapers was to go for advertising, because that's something that we know that it's going to be hard to ignore if it gains enough traction. So
they're a business at the end of the day, and if you stop their income stream, then they cease to exist. Makes sense.
Totally. They rely on advertising more than I actually realized to begin with. Some publications may get half or more of their revenue from advertising. So it just seemed like that might work where other tactics actually, unfortunately, had not been successful in the past.
Great. So just quickly, a bit more about you then. So what were you doing? So you were in campaigning before this already?
So I'd worked for a few organizations that operate in sort of human rights campaigning. So I worked for Amnesty International for a long time as a fundraiser, actually. I was working in another charity around the time that we started the campaign. And then I ultimately left that job to sort of get involved in this time.
Because I think there's a lot of people out there who would have seen the problem. Okay, these outlets are proprietors of hate, but wouldn't necessarily know, okay, what's the solution? How do I stop them? So it's interesting that you saw the problem and you had a solution, you had a plan, and you had people around you clearly who also had a similar, I don't know, do you need a certain skill set to sort of start up a campaign like this?
I think the great thing about this sort of campaign is that actually the core of it is really straightforward. And I think sometimes campaigners like to mysticize what they do a little bit, but actually if you've got access to social media and you know how to take a screenshot, you can challenge problematic media content quite straightforwardly. I guess maybe the reason I've thought back about this, and maybe the reason that we hit on this particular idea at the time was having worked in fundraising, and it was maybe a natural question that I was asking myself, and other fundraisers I knew were sort of going, well, okay, who's funding this? Who are the funders? And that's how you might actually gain a bit of traction.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I can definitely see how people who understand how sort of the passing around of money would ask that question, and because it's not a question I don't think I would have asked this question. I think I would have been like, let's take them on, sort of like fire versus fire sort of thing. Let's just, I don't know, but yeah, to go after their value, the company's values, and pin that to the advertisement in the, I mean, I call them the gutter press. That's the term I use. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a minute, but no, it's something that I think works very well in convincing people to, okay, this is actually a strategy that's going to work. And we're going to come on in a minute to your successes and stuff. So, but we'll come to that. So you've kind of touched on why you set it up already, and you've touched on why you're targeting advertisers. So the question I have is, I'm assuming you get this as a kind of rebuttal to what you do all the time, but is what you're doing not an example of the kind of quote unquote cancel culture that we hear so many right wingers banging on about all the time?
So you do hear those sorts of phrases, right? And actually, I kind of think it's a bit of a red herring, and it's like anyone who's ever done anything campaigning, anyone who's ever campaigned on anything controversial is going to get called a load of names, and there's going to be all sorts of tropes and phrases that get wheeled out. I remember for a long time, people would talk about political correctness gone mad, and these are cliches and red herrings. And so I guess I was thinking about this earlier, and the thing is, right, people have been using their power as consumers to try to change the world in line with their values for a very long time, actually even back to the 18th century, maybe even earlier, right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing inherently, like, these tactics can be used for any kind of cause, and people across the political spectrum use consumer power.
Yeah.
Right wing, left wing, people who may not even think of themselves as party political. So I think there's something a little bit superficial about this very recent attempt to vilify a particular type of campaigning with those sorts of terms, because actually these tactics are things that basically everyone has been using forever.
Yeah, totally. And I remember when Piers Morgan was using his massive platform, like 7-8 million people he's got on Twitter, to sort of get people not to go to Greggs anymore because they dare to have a vegan alternative on their menu. And I remember thinking, you are supposed to be this front man for like free speech and anti-cancel culture and all these ridiculous tropes that you throw out to try and make yourself relevant, mate. And there you are kicking off because Greggs has just put something different on the menu that you think is about woke culture or virtue signaling or something. I just think you're just a total hypocrite. So the right do it as well, don't they? Quite clearly,
well, yeah. I mean, people. And
well, actually, I should rephrase that. I'm not saying you are left necessarily and he is right necessarily, but what I mean to say is, you often hear the accusation from the right that it's left wingers who are trying to cancel, and quite clearly, it's right wingers who do the same when the shoe's on the other foot. They're hypocrites ultimately. Both sides use this tactic.
It's a tactic that you see everywhere. I mean, the example that I think is actually quite interesting. And absolutely, I hesitate to raise it because it's not exactly an example that you want to be sort of following. But there was a really problematic episode a few years ago around something called Gamergate.
I remember, yeah.
It was actually essentially kind of evolved into parts of the people involved in Gamergate evolved into what became now known as the alt-right, right? So it was a pretty toxic kind of episode. And it's one of these things as well. It's quite hard to figure out from the outside, but it was, what happened was the not at that time called alt-right, but the soon to be alt-right, they organized a big campaign against a US publication called Gawker. That they didn't like, and they went after the advertisers of Gawker, and they did they had quite an impact, right?
Yeah, did damage, yeah.
And a lot of the same people who were involved in that later went on to sort of denounce our friends Sleeping Giants in the US and be very critical of campaigns like Stop Funding Hate. But actually, the proto alt-right was using those sorts of tactics way before actually other campaigns like Sleeping Giants and Stop Funding Hate came along.
Yeah. Putting pressure on advertisers is a tactic that's as old as time, really, or as old as capitalism, I guess. Yes. For sure. So I guess the follow-on question from this is, one, do advertisers actually care? I assume the answer is yes. And two, but more importantly, do they actually have a responsibility? Is capitalism not supposed to be all about cutthroat and you just bring the money in? Do they care, and do they have a responsibility ultimately?
So I think on responsibility, I think it's kind of a fairly mainstream thing to say now, that companies need to think about where are they sourcing their clothing from, if they're a clothing retailer. People care about the conditions in the factories where those clothes are produced, and people want the companies that they shop with to consider their impact on climate change and minimize those sorts of harms. So I think we've moved on a long way from the time when people may have said, oh, companies just exist to make money, if ever there was a time. Because actually, go back a bit further, there's always been a tradition of businesses caring about the society in which they exist, and even if their primary purpose is to generate profit, they actually are trying to do some good in the world as well. So I think I think they do have a responsibility, and I actually think most people broadly would agree. It's just the question is, what should those responsibilities be?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Clearly, that there have always been sort of benevolent CEOs and owners and things who want to give back to their society and want to be part of the kind of greater good. And clearly, there are those that are just sociopaths who want to exploit absolutely everything and don't care about anything. And then obviously there's a range in the middle, of course. That's ultimately what human nature is like, isn't it? But yeah, I guess you're absolutely right that we live in a world where increasingly consumers care more about the values of a company, particularly things like you said, environment, your carbon footprint, I mean, I this is something that I wouldn't have looked at 10 years ago, but I do now. Not everything, because I'm not a psychopath and I haven't got time to check every single company that I use. But broadly speaking, I mean, we're all human, but it is something that's on my mind now. I do feel guilt when I find out that a product that I buy or something is linked to famine in the third world or exploitation and and that sort of stuff. And then I consider my consumer habits. So for sure. And I think our generation, from when I was doing my campaigning, we looked at Gen Z and we looked at their buying habits, and they were much more sort of socially conscious as a generation. And consumers, I remember looking at Nike and Adidas, and they were really looking at how to target that generation with sort of value-based advertisement and stuff. So yeah.
If you, I mean, I just think there's a straightforward and practical and positive way. You go into a shop, you're looking for some coffee. One bag of coffee says fair trade, and that's credible. And there may not be a massive price difference between the two, even if you are paying a bit more for the fair trade one. It's just in some ways it's a bit of a no-brainer for a lot of the time. If it's affordable, why would you not try and go with the company that's doing the right thing?
Exactly. Totally. So my next question is, obviously, so you set this up. It's fairly recent, but from what I can tell, based on what I read about you guys, you've already had some fairly major successes. So tell me about what your biggest successes have been so far.
So one of the biggest measurable changes is there's been a really significant drop in the number of anti-migrant front pages in the UK press.
Okay.
Across a year, for example. So
is in 2021, you mean, or within
Yeah. So now, if you look at, if you don't see the relentless drip of those front pages that we were seeing in 2016. There were well over 100 of those anti-migrant front pages in 2016. I think 70 at least in the Daily Express that year.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Can I
over? Yeah.
Can I just ask though?
Yeah.
Was 2016 different to say 2014 or 2013? Because in my head, I'm imagining that they were trying to get people riled up for the referendum, and obviously they were all very pro-Brexit. And Vote Leave and Leave EU ran very, very toxic, xenophobic campaigns. I wonder if they dialed up their kind of dog whistle xenophobia during that year. Was that? Do you have any knowledge of whether there was a spike in kind of anti-migrant front pages in that year itself? Was that a unique year, 2016?
It wasn't unique, but you're right. There was a year-on-year rise up to 2016, and there's a brilliant journalist called Liz Gerard who has literally gone and counted and
Really? Okay.
the headlines, the front pages, and produced some really good data. And you see the graph goes up to 2016. But
Right.
the thing that I think surprised a lot of people was, even after the referendum was over, papers
It
continued to pump
continued.
out those
Yeah.
anti-migrant pages. So it wasn't
Was that
only
was that because it sold? They worked out that it was a winning formula.
apparently I think that was a factor, and that, I mean,
Right.
that's what people in the media say, that it,
Okay.
and the problem is, of course, once you go down that road,
Mm.
if you're making money,
Yeah.
you can see commercially that if they're just looking at it from a commercial lens, they want to keep making money, right?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
But so the positive thing is, if you make the same measure for the last year or the year before, it's barely a handful. It's
Right.
really dropped down, the number of front pages. So there are definitely still all sorts of issues in the media, but those really overt, loud, garish front pages that were not only on the papers themselves and being displayed in the supermarkets, but also then being relayed through the broadcast media, that has dropped down massively. And the new editor of the Daily Express has publicly referenced Stop Funding Hate in talking about the changes that he's made. And there's also
Really?
yeah.
Okay. That's really positive. Yeah. So
Yeah.
so that editor, so the current editor of the Daily Express has basically said their pressure has forced us to change the way we present these stories.
What I mean, you sort of need to look at the way he said. He gave an interview to Channel 4, but what he said is, he's come in and it was really important to him that they stop the anti-migrant stuff, and it was very much on his mind that the Daily Express had been on Stop Funding Hate's list.
Right.
And yeah, and I guess the thing I would always say is that is the achievement of the Stop Funding Hate supporter community.
Yeah.
The reason the papers care, the reason the advertisers care, is only because thousands and thousands of people obviously cared about this enough to take action and got this in front of them and got this on their agenda.
Great. So I remember some of the big names of big companies that sort of like were part of the first wave of people. So like you had like Lego pulled out of the Daily Mail, didn't they? Or
that's right. Lego was probably the first big high profile, extremely surprising kind of big win. We were all still volunteers, and it was only a few weeks after we launched, and suddenly it was this massive news story. And then we had I mean, it's funny, there wasn't like hundreds that we knew about publicly, but there was Paperchase, there was Evans Cycles, there was the Body Shop.
Yeah.
There was enough going on that you could see that the campaign was making progress.
Yeah.
But the funny thing, or the interesting thing that came out later, was when the new editor of the Daily Mail came in and sort of pushed the paper in a less toxic direction, let's say.
Yeah, slightly, not enough. Geordie Greig, because he was we remember him from being, obviously he was the editor of the Mail on Sunday, wasn't he? And he was a Remainer and had a different a different worldview to Paul Dacre, who was just probably the most toxic man in the country at the time.
Right. So it's I mean, you don't want to overstate it, but there has been a noticeable change at least.
Yeah.
But at a certain point he said, well, since I've come in, 265 advertisers have come back. And
265 advertisers came back.
Right?
Wow, okay.
We had no idea that number of advertisers had left in the first place.
Right, okay.
Because if you're a big brand, actually, it's quite understandable that you might just quietly back away without making.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Because you don't want to get dragged into the culture war stuff ultimately.
Totally. You don't want, controversy is generally something that, mainstream brands want to avoid.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So what's the end goal here? When do you retire? I mean, what's the end goal of Stop Funding Hate?
So the sort of top line is we want to make hate unprofitable.
Mm-hmm. So that, I mean, that's a multi-generational, multi-century thing, isn't it? Or have you got like a 10-year plan or something?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's, off the top of my head, it's in the region of 400 billion pounds every year gets spent on advertising, right, worldwide. And at the moment, too much of that money is going to people who publish hateful clickbait as a business model.
Yeah.
So what we want to get to is the point where it's just not a great way to make money anymore, because enough of that 400 billion has been redirected away from the hateful clickbait merchants and towards responsible media that at least apply a basic set of ethical journalistic standards, right? So in theory, it could happen quite quickly if enough big brands move. If we can, I don't think it, because ultimately money talks, and some of the world's biggest advertisers are actually starting to talk more and more about the impact of that money. So I don't know how long, but I don't think it could. Maybe 10 years, it may be a little more, it could be less.
Good. Well, I'm glad someone's working on it, because it's one of the things that my community, we pull our hair out every day talking about. I mean, we feed it as much as anyone, I suppose, because we're outraged by it, and I guess that's part of their business model, isn't it? Is to try to outrage the left, and then the right get all kind of upset that we're outraged, and then it feeds the war, doesn't it? And it feeds the clicks, and generates the reach. So we're aware that we're feeding it. But I think ultimately, one, we can't help ourselves, and two, we feel as though we have almost like a civic duty to try and call it out. But it's a trap.
But there's a cycle there, and the way you break that cycle is by taking the money out of the equation.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
That's the part, and I think more and more people are getting smart to the fact that some of these clickbait columnists do it because they want your outrage. Yeah. They're going to say horrible things to make you angry, because actually that's part of how they generate attention. So I think there's a way, at least it feels like we can see what the solution might be, even if there's a lot of work to do to get there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'm glad we have a roadmap. Totally.
And I should say, it's not just us working on this. There are lots of other organizations now around the world doing the same thing. So there's a kind of a movement behind it.
So, I mean, are there any other names that anyone would be familiar with?
One standout example is Sleeping Giants in the US.
Yeah.
They went after a website called Breitbart.
Yep, we know Breitbart well. Yep.
We may well know them. They got 4,000 advertisers to pull out from Breitbart.
That's good.
Yeah. Amazing result. There's a video of Steve Bannon himself complaining about Sleeping Giants and how much money that's cost Breitbart.
Was this before or after the Trump presidency, or during?
So this was during the Trump presidency. So Sleeping Giants kicked off probably not long after Trump was elected.
Yeah. Because I remember Trump was at one point sharing almost entirely Breitbart articles, and before Trump, obviously Breitbart was this wacko sort of InfoWar type alt-right site that everyone knew was sort of nuts, and then suddenly it was just incredibly mainstreamed because the president of the United States was sharing their content.
Yeah, it's amazing. That process of normalization is both interesting and sometimes terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I was terrified by it. Yeah, 100%. So the next question is probably arguably the most important, I guess, that I have for you, which is, how are you defining hate? And I guess who are you to decide what constitutes hate and what doesn't? I mean, because ultimately it's a subjective thing, isn't it? Hate. I mean, so I'll give you an example, right? So for me personally, I look at the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Telegraph, the Express, and I see hate on the front of those pages daily. However, the Times, which is obviously a Murdoch-owned newspaper, but with editorial independence, generally speaking, from what I understand, obviously they're still right-wing. They were, they've got right-wingers on their staff and stuff, but they do publish a lot of what I would say sort of socially liberal stuff. Generally speaking, they're quite sensible. But there was an article the other day that sort of was almost talking about wiping out gypsy community, and there was massive outrage about this. I don't know if you saw it, but is the Times a paper that you would go after because of a single article, or does it have to be sustained over a long time? I mean, how are you? One, how are you judging hate, and two, how are you deciding on your targets?
So we're not a watchdog, right? So we don't have the capacity or the we don't have the capacity to start with to systematically go through and rate every article in every publication in the UK.
No, someone should, by the way, but yeah.
Someone should. And actually, the Muslim Council of Britain's Centre for Media Monitoring has developed a really impressive system looking specifically at Islamophobia.
Right,
and really, you need that to be expanded to cover all forms of discrimination.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But so what we started off doing was focusing on the most obvious and extreme examples.
Right.
And Exhibit A would be, in 2015, The Sun published an article comparing African migrants to cockroaches by a commentator whose name was widely circulated and known at the time, and it's been a lot less prominent since then, called Katie Hopkins.
Yeah, I remember. That was The Sun. I thought that was the Mail. That was The Sun, was it? Okay.
So at the time that article was published.
Right. Okay.
And that caused such concern that the United Nations issued a statement calling out The Sun and the Daily Express for hate speech.
Yeah.
And they talked about that example, and then they also talked about longer term problems in the UK press. And then in 2016, the UNHCR called out the Daily Mail and the Sun for their unique hostility to migrants. So when we started, we were like, let's look at the most extreme examples and let's focus on the 3 UK newspapers that have all been called out by the United Nations over their coverage. So it's a nice, clear, pretty
yeah, you can't, inarguable place to start, really. Yeah.
So that's where we started. Now, since then, we've seen a significant change in all 3 of those papers. And we've grown as a community, and we regularly hear from members of our community about all sorts of obviously problematic stuff in other publications. So we can't be a watchdog, but what we then try to do is say, well, the people who really are best placed to make a judgment call about hate are the people who face that discrimination themselves day in and day out, week in, week out. So if someone comes to us and says, we're really concerned about this particular Times article, the impact it's going to have on our community, that's something that we will do our best to respond to. So, and that's part of our philosophy of being a sort of community-driven campaign.
Yeah.
Inevitably, that means that it's not a comprehensive process, because it depends on the issues that members of our community are raising with us.
Yeah.
And also what are people wanting to take action on, because we won't ask people to do anything on an issue if we don't think that there's a good chance it's going to have an impact.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah. So I mean, so you're sort of responding to those who are being discriminated against. They're coming to you and saying, "Can you help us fight back?" sort of thing. And
that's the model that we're shifting to.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, presumably, actually, I think I have a question that's perfect for this. Yeah, actually, this is my very next question, in fact. So my next question was, okay, the way I phrased it is, you claim to be non-partisan, and yet all your targets are right-wing newspapers. Why is this? I guess the way I was going to reframe this was, do you get a lot of Tories complaining that the Guardian is smearing conservatism, or are you getting a lot of minorities? This has turned into a slightly leading question, I guess, but presumably what you're getting you're getting minority groups who are coming to you and saying, we're being smeared by the right-wing press. Can you help us fight back? Or is it a balance?
Not always the right-wing press, right? So one important thing to say is, since we've changed our approach, one of the big focuses that we've picked up and taken up is Channel 4 having run a really toxic documentary targeting travellers, which happened last year.
Okay. Yeah. And they're very much a left-wing news outlet.
They're perceived. Some people try to pigeon them as left-wing, but I think most people would not describe them as a right-wing.
No, they're definitely not right-wing. Definitely not right-wing.
So and again, in response to allies and partners from Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, we put together an action where we went after the advertisers on the online version of that program, and a number of those online advertisers pulled out.
Okay.
And so that is the new focus. So if that was to happen again, or any outlet was to run that kind of content, we would be ready to respond to that.
Okay, good. So yeah, so you've across the spectrum, you've gone after organizations that have produced something that you perceive as toxic.
We definitely we don't limit it in that way. I mean, in terms, coming back to the question about what do we mean by hate? Well, hate speech is actually, I mean, hate speech is a complex term, but generally it's understood to refer to identity-based hate. So racism, homophobia, transphobia, religious hatred, and that's kind of, there are some UN definitions which are quite useful for that. So saying nasty things about socialists or conservatives would not fall under the same umbrella as demonizing people because of their religion or because of their race in a sort of international human rights framework. If that makes sense.
Okay. So you're working from a UN definition of hatred.
That's what we're guided by. The caveat to that is it's that's what we refer to, and that's what we put on our website. But hate speech is still an emerging concept within international human rights discourse. So there isn't one single agreed, absolutely nailed down definition that all that's universally upheld. But there's a broad area that actually is quite commonsensical, and it is around just extreme forms of discrimination and inciting either hatred or discrimination.
But presumably, to your mind, you're not really flirting with the grey area. For you, when you go after a target, it's fairly black and white. They've crossed the line. This is toxic.
That's what we do. I mean, at the very least, there has to be a very strong view and a very strong concern among people who are better placed than me to make a judgment about it.
Okay.
That's the general approach.
Cool. I think that's an important question, because I think a lot of people would probably throw the charge of partisanship at an organization like this, because especially if most of your targets, like you just said earlier on, the Mail, the Sun, the Express, obviously all right-wing newspapers in the UK. So it's good to know that obviously you're prepared to go after those across the spectrum. Doesn't matter, regardless of what political persuasion they are. So I guess this brings me on neatly to my next question, which is about GB News. Andrew Neil's venture. Tell me about why you decided to go after them. Why did they become a target? And you went after them before they'd even set up and before they'd even started their first sort of live performance. I don't call it performance. Why did you go after them preemptively?
So there's a simple answer to that, which is loads of Stop Funding Hate supporters were asking us from early in the year, will you be publishing details of the GB News advertisers when it launches?
Yeah, I think I was probably one of those.
You might well have been, right? So there was clearly a demand for that information. And so we sort of decided fairly early on, as a basic minimum, we will inform people of who the advertisers are. Because actually they're advertising on the channel, so it's not secret or confidential. It's just that, people are interested in that information, we'll provide that information. But the reason that we then, I suppose, stepped it up was we were mindful that for months and months, beginning sort of late summer last year, it was being trailed in multiple different UK media that there were going to be 2 Fox News style channels soon launch UK, right? Fox News style. And at the same time, we knew from allies in the US that Fox News was having one of the most bizarre and horrifying years it's ever had in terms of its coverage of the coronavirus. In terms of the kind of toxicity it was pumping out into US public discourse and the impact that was having. So and people were saying, what's Stop Funding Hate going to do about this? There's all these 2 Fox News style channels coming down the line. Are you just going to wait, or are you actually going to start getting organized? So we thought, well, we've got to start getting organized, and we'll see, but we need to be ready.
Good. So should we be concerned about a Fox News type organization setting up shop and being successful in the UK? I know you've just touched on that there. But like you said, there were 2, then obviously one dropped out, the Murdoch one disappeared somehow, somewhere. And GB News have came in. They started quite strongly by all accounts, but have looked like they're starting to flop slightly these days. But how concerned should we be about a kind of Fox News style, very partisan? Obviously, there's Ofcom they're supposed to be in check, but how concerned should we be about a Fox News style outlet coming to the UK?
I think it's reasonable to be very concerned. If you just look at the track record of Fox News in the US, both on racism. I mean, Fox News is notorious for racism. They're notorious for climate change denial, and now they are incredibly notorious for COVID misinformation. Just today, I saw that they were have been pumping out anti-vax type stuff, or at least, you know, raising, you know, deterring people from taking a vaccine for COVID.
Doesn't surprise me.
It's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it is.
How harmful all of that is. It's not just hate, it's also the misinformation. And to look at that and go,
potentially will cost lives ultimately, won't it? I mean,
people have accused, I mean, mainstream publications in the US have accused Fox of directly, you know, contributing to the impacts of the death toll of the pandemic, and also the harm to US democracy, because Fox has been implicated in the kind of creating the climate that led to the violent and deadly insurrection in January in the US. So to look at that and think, right, let's import that here, it just seems unbelievable that anyone would think that was a good thing for the country. And again, to be honest, I'd say, whatever your political viewpoint, there are some aspects of what's happened in America with Fox News that, you know, do we want that kind of polarization and division in our society? I think the overwhelming majority of people in Britain don't want to live in a more polarized and more divided society than we already do.
No, of course. And I think we should be fair as well and say that obviously the people who they have on Fox News, they are on the very, very nutty wing of the kind of libertarian movement. Whereas in the UK, you might argue that the Andrew Neil's channel, I mean, I haven't really watched it, but from what I understand, they're not quite as batshit as the Fox News guys. But that's not to say that it wouldn't start off relatively, you know, it's not to say that it couldn't slide into the kind of Fox News, because I guess Fox News didn't start off as batshit as they currently are. So
completely. And you know, I think we felt it was really important to help to demonstrate that if creating a Fox News style channel is the plan, it will be met with a lot of popular opposition.
Yeah, good.
If the end result of this is, we were worried, you know, we were worrying too much, then, you know, that's you'd rather be in that position than not to have taken action and not to have mobilized when that was kind of being mooted, if that makes sense.
Totally. I think everyone was very happy to be marched up the hill for this in anticipation of something being quite toxic, and it did turn out in the end to be quite toxic. I mean, so what have your opinions been on GB News since it's been launched? Has it become the thing you feared it would?
So I think one very important thing to highlight is, within weeks of GB News launching, a prominent commentator called India Willoughby,
I remember,
quit the channel.
She did,
quit the channel, and she accused them of opening the gates of hell on transphobia. So frankly,
and that just gave you a massive tick, didn't it? Yep. Okay, justified now, more or less.
Well, it was like, you know, and you know, someone who's a trans woman herself gave the channel a chance, actually decided to engage with it. I think she would not describe herself as a lefty, actually. And having done that, she came to the conclusion that they were heavily biased against trans people, and that was dangerous, right? So unfortunately, a number of the concerns that we had in the run-up have to some extent come to fruition. Also, some of the commentary around coronavirus, COVID, a lot of people have had a lot of concerns about it already. If anything, you might have anticipated that they would have started more gently and then maybe crank that up. But there's been enough examples already that I think a lot of people are already very concerned.
I agreed. I think they knew their base. They knew their base was going to be sort of very UKIP sort of base. And they pander. Their content seems to pander to that slice of the right wing electorate, and therefore, it's not a surprise to me to see them, trying to talk down masks and trying to, lock down skeptics and all of the classic UKIP commentary that we've been listening to for the last 2 years. It's just verbalizing that kind of rubbish, and so it comes as no surprise, and that's dangerous ultimately. And so it's absolutely within our right as consumers to say, if we're going to buy your products, well, we're not going to buy your products because you're advertising on this unethical thing that's actually might kill my mum, might kill my grandma. If my grandma dies because of COVID, because 10-15% of the population are listening to GB News and they're telling them that the coronavirus should be, we should demask and we should come out of lockdown, then the products that I was buying from you, that's going to have I'm going to be furious, absolutely furious with your company for being part of that. So it makes perfect sense.
There are lots of reasons to be concerned. And I think that's a really good point. As a consumer, you don't have to wait for a media channel to publish content comparing African migrants to cockroaches and getting called out by the UN to start saying to the companies who shop with, you can advertise where you want. It's up to, they're not obliged to advertise with every media channel. They can choose just because it doesn't fit with their values or they're a bit concerned about the direction of it. That's a good enough reason to back away.
Totally. As I said earlier, I think the model you've got is a good one for sure. So the next question I have is, obviously we've spoken about hate, we've spoken about the toxicity of our of elements of our press. My view of our press, and I'm sure I've seen stats to back this up, is that it's one of the least trusted press in Europe. So the question I have is our press unique in the kind of bile and hatred and divisiveness and potentially danger to people? Or are we just getting carried away and every country has the same issues?
I think there's a particular problem in the UK press, actually. And this is, I wouldn't necessarily have said this when we started, but when you look at how endemic and widespread discrimination of various kinds is in the UK press, and the fact that it's actually across the spectrum to various degrees, I think there's a systemic problem in the UK press, and there's issues around. There's a big debate opening up now around institutional racism in the UK press. One thing that really struck me was a couple of years ago, the Society of Editors gave their first ever Lifetime Achievement Award to a UK editor. And bearing in mind, what you're saying here is that this must be an exemplary career that's been led here to be getting the first ever Lifetime Achievement Award. They gave that award to Paul Dacre when he retired from the Daily Mail. And what that's saying is, we as the Society of Editors believe this is an example the whole industry should follow. That seems to be the implication.
What was what were they judging on? Because I can well understand. You get the what is it, the Time Person of the Year award, which is not necessarily for the most ethical person, but for the person who's made the biggest splash. And obviously, I think Stalin was on there, and Mussolini, and obviously Trump have been on there. Were the Society of Editors basing it on impact, or were they basing it on role model? Do you know?
I think you'd have to ask them.
Yeah. Okay.
But what I've heard people say, and I think it's a really important point, that if you judge achievement in journalism by number of newspapers sold, you may come to a different conclusion than if you judge achievement in newspaper journalism by sort of international journalism standards, which actually includes, if you look at the International Federation of Journalists sort of code, that includes doing your best to avoid fueling hatred and discrimination.
Right. Okay.
So it feels like the standards of the UK newspaper industry are actually not aligned with certainly international standards on journalism from what I've made out.
Yeah. And would you say that it's the tabloids particularly, or would you say that it's a mixture of broadsheets and tabloids?
Honestly, the impression, the impression I've gained over the years is those extremes that you might have seen in the Sun in 2016 and the Mail were actually just extreme manifestations of problems that exist all across the UK newspaper industry.
Okay, so newspaper industry as opposed to just journalism broadly.
I guess the newspaper industry, because interestingly, trust in broadcast media is still much higher in Britain than it is in the press, and the BBC is still, for all the controversies, the BBC is still perceived, has a much higher level of trust. So there is a particular kind of problem in the newspaper world, differently from the broadcast world at the moment.
Sure, and I think I would probably agree with that. I mean, I try and read the same stories in every newspaper, just so I'm across the kind of the different framings of stories and stuff. But if I want like a serious overview of what's happening, I do generally tend to go to the BBC or Sky, Channel 4. I know you said earlier Channel 4 let themselves down on that thing, and that you went after them on that thing for. But so I guess the question I have next is about Ofcom then, and whether or not, because Ofcom is there to police the press ultimately, isn't it? It's to keep them in line. There are laws there to stop them from being too partial. Does Ofcom work?
So actually, Ofcom is specific to the broadcast media. So the press has IPSO.
Of course, IPSO.
Some press has IPSO, right? So there's Ofcom and there's IPSO. And traditionally, Ofcom would probably have been seen as more robust.
Yeah.
And one example of that is that Ofcom has actually sanctioned some broadcasters before for hate speech, whereas IPSO actually, its code refuses to take action on what they call group-based discrimination. So
I was going to ask you if you've come across John Danzig, because I'm John Danzig, the journalist. I remember he did a whole presentation on how he wrote a very long thing to IPSO, challenging, I think, something that Paul Dacre ironically had written in the Daily Mail or something, and they wrote back and basically said, sorry, there's nothing we can do. So this, I guess, if I can rephrase the question, does IPSO have the teeth to actually sanction papers that overstep the mark?
We know a lot of people are very skeptical about IPSO.
Yeah.
Stop Funding Hate's approach generally is to not get into issues around regulation.
Okay.
Because what we would say is, however good or bad a regulator may be, it's never going to be a guarantee for advertisers that they're not going to end up alongside toxic stuff. And it's never going to be a substitute for advertisers thinking much more carefully about where their money is going. But certainly we know a lot of people who would have a lot of big questions around IPSO.
Yeah, sure. I get, so one of the things I'm sure you've been following the whole Paul Dacre as the head of Ofcom farce, I would call it. Obviously the government brought in a committee to shortlist and then to sort of look through the various candidates, of which Paul Dacre was one, and they decided that Paul Dacre didn't fit the bill. And so instead of tossing Paul Dacre in the bin, the government have tried to restack the committee in order to try and get their favoured candidate back in the running. I just wondered. I mean, perhaps you're not able to talk on this as a sort of non-partisan group, but have you got any sort of views on that episode?
I guess. So yeah, I mean, we don't have a position on regulators and regulation, but what we have heard is that some of the pushback around the conversation on GB News, people have been saying, well, it's all going to be fine because Ofcom is this wonderful, marvelous, effective, independent, powerful regulator that will just make sure nothing bad ever happens
until Paul Dacre's in charge of it. Yeah,
and I think it's reasonable to say, well, look at the way things are going right now with Ofcom. If I was an advertiser, I would not be assuming that my brand was going to be safe and that Ofcom was going to make everything okay, and that I had nothing to worry about being associated with a channel like GB News.
Yeah, and presumably the kind of the media sections of businesses will be aware of who Paul Dacre is and how often and the relationship that Paul Dacre would have to Ofcom and that sort of stuff, would they?
I think
you wouldn't have to explain all of that to them, would you necessarily?
I think within the advertising industry, there is quite a high awareness
Yeah, of who's
of
who. Yeah.
the history of the Daily Mail, the controversies around
Okay.
the Daily
Yeah.
Mail, and obviously Dacre was the editor there for 26 years. So
Okay. Yeah.
I definitely think I mean, I haven't done a survey, but I think it's
No.
probably quite widely known.
Good. Oh yeah, I'm just curious, just because you never know. Maybe there's potential ignorance on sort of political matters, but I doubt it. I think probably these are professionals at the end of the day, so you would expect them to know that kind of stuff.
One thing I would say is it's been like every single time you contact an advertiser and raise a concern with them, you're actually helping to build that awareness within the advertising industry.
Yeah.
And I actually think partly through the efforts of everyone who's been taking action over the last few years, there's a much greater awareness now and sensitivity in the advertising industry than maybe there would have been 5 years ago. So it's always worth having those conversations.
Yeah, good. So it's in their interest to sort of have done their homework, because they're going to get harassed, or not harassed, they're going to get lobbied by members of the public who care about this stuff now. So they're going to need to know about it.
They're going to get politely engaged with.
Precisely. Yeah. Lobbied, harassed, whatever. But yeah, politely engaged, of course. So a couple of questions left then. So firstly, you at the beginning you spoke about how hate crime sort of related, or how hate in public life was sort of going up as a result of what you saw as hate in the press. My question is, can you identify a causal link between the kind of the front page bile and then the hate crime? Because there was a big spike in hate crime after the referendum, and it's been going up ever since. Certainly Islamophobic hate crime towards Jewish people. I think hate crime towards trans people has gone up as well in the LGBT community. So all the kind of people that have generally been on the receiving end of sort of discrimination, in particular in the tabloids, there's been a spike in hate crime in the last few years. So is there a causal link? Have you identified a causal link?
So again, we're not the experts on hate crime, but academic experts on hate crime have repeatedly said that they're seeing a causal connection between the hate in the media and the hate on our streets.
Okay.
And for example, Leicester University actually has a centre for hate studies, and there is a number of really good academics there, one of whom we interviewed for one of our videos, and he talked about how when he's spoken to victims of hate crime, and he was particularly talking about disability hate crime, which doesn't always get the attention that it ought to. But he was saying that literally some of the things that people were reporting were being shouted at them as they were being attacked were sort of paralleling or echoing stuff that had been appearing in the newspapers.
All right.
So certainly there's a strong view among a number of experts who look into this in detail that you can actually track some of those tropes from the newspaper content to the experiences of hate crime victims.
Yeah, it's a big giveaway. I mean, it's something that I saw a lot of after the referendum were EU nationals posting on social media, talking about how they've been told that they've lived here 20, 30, 40 years, never heard a xenophobic or racist word said against them in their life. All of a sudden, they're being, people are coming up to their faces and saying, "You lost, get over it," or go back to your own country. All the kind of Brexit slogans that were used, particularly in the press, were being repeated to them in a kind of very xenophobic way. So it was quite clear that people felt empowered and emboldened to go out and repeat these things to people in a very harmful and discriminatory way. I can see how that's a good way of tracking it.
And also, I mean, it's if people were not influenced by the things that they see and hear in newspapers, advertising would be entirely pointless, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's like, of course, all of us, every single one of us without exception, are influenced all the time by what we see and hear around us. And obviously the media is going to have an important role in that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So my final question is, what can members of the public do if they have heard this, like what they've heard, and they want to support you guys? What's the best way we can help? So
if you see toxic stuff online, whether it's the Mail Online, wherever it is, take a screenshot, the advertiser, if it's got advertising next to it, tweet it if you're on Twitter, or send it if you're on Facebook. And if you tag Stop Funding Hate, we're always interested to see and hear what people are concerned about, number one.
Yeah, so we can be your eyes and ears on the ground.
And loads of, that's entirely how Stop Funding Hate has had the impact it's had. And the more people are getting in there and finding stuff and highlighting it to advertisers and copying us in, that's probably the single most useful thing anyone can do. And other than that, obviously we're on Twitter and Facebook. Follow us, join our email lists, become a committed supporter, join our community, and get involved in the discussion.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time, Rich. It's been a real pleasure. So for anyone who's listening and has made it the whole way through this episode, thank you very much and well done. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to Richard and myself talking about Richard's brilliant work. For me, I've got to say, you guys are one of the best groups out there, because I think for so long, so many of us have identified the problem as we see it as hate. Particularly, I think in our community, we see it on the kind of the right-wing tabloids, the one you mentioned at the beginning, really, the Mail, the Sun, the Express, but have never really known how to kind of deal with it. And like I said earlier on, I think probably what we do is we feed it and often make it worse. So it's good, really good that we finally got a group that's prepared they've got a roadmap, they've got a strategy, it appears to be working. And we're not feeding the kind of culture war mentality that making these guys even more powerful. So thank you very much, Richard. It's been a pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you smash it and, get these guys to really change the way that they frame these stories. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.